Okay, we're going to get started. We've got a panel, Internet Governance Update panel, presented by ARIN. I'd like to invite Cathy Handley up here. She'll introduce her panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. For those that don't know me, I'm Cathy Handley. I'm ARIN's Executive Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy. I'd like to introduce my panel. Sally Wentworth is the Senior Manager of Public Policy for ISOC. I think most of you know the gentleman in the middle in the suit, Vint, Cerf, Chief Internet Evangelist and ARIN Board Member. Dan Alexander, Network Engineer with Comcast. Chip Sharp, Director of Technology Policy at Cisco, and Bill Graham, who is a Senior Policy Advisor at ISOC and an ICANN board member. I'm going to start everything off by giving you kind of a high-level explanation of what we're going to talk about, but this panel needs people in the audience to ask questions. We're all deeply entrenched in WCIT and ITRs and several other four-letter words, but we need you to ask your questions, or we'll just tell you the things that we know. First off, WCIT, World Conference on International Telecommunication Regulations. It addresses the ITRs, the International Telecommunication Regulations. They're a treaty, a full-blown treaty between countries, and whatever happens in the ITRs is applicable to the signatories, not everyone in this room. However, I think it's a safe bet that if your government signs off on something, they may want you to follow those rules. But again, so whatever you're going to hear up here today, the actual treaty is only applicable to the signatories of the treaty. In December 3rd through 14th in Dubai, there will be a fun fest held known as WCIT, and at that point, the treaty will be modified to some extent. One of the things I've been asked in all the time I've been speaking and doing this is how much, what's going to happen, and I really don't know. It's a guess, and it's anybody's guess. There have been, the treaty itself is the articles, there's 10 articles that cover 19 pages. Over the work we've done for the last 2 years with all the suggestions that different members have put in on modifications to the ITRs, it's grown to over 300 pages. So it will not, the one thing I think I'm pretty sure of is it will not be that long when it comes out of Dubai. There's just no way that we can get all the agreement. So there's been lots of press and lots of rumors that the WCIT is the opportunity for the ITU to take over the internet. That really isn't the case at all. There hasn't been any requests, any modifications, any contributions that say, let the ITU take over the internet. However, there are a lot of proposals that you really need to take a look at and think about. Some of them address routing, spam, network security, but the panel is going to talk about those various issues and how they see them affecting them. I'm going to ask Vint to make some opening remarks on WCIT, and then Bill is going to talk about kind of what's in our future, and then I'm going to open it up to all of the panelists to kind of give their view. And again, I really, really, really encourage you, whether you're a remote participator or you're here in the room, please ask questions. Thank you. Vint?
Thank you very much, Cathy. Good morning, everyone. In case you're wondering, there we go. How's that? In case you're wondering why I'm wearing a headset, the folks doing AV here have kindly offered me one which gets feeds from all the microphones. I can hear better. Some of you may not know I've got a 65 dB loss in both ears, and while I have hearing aids, this is much better. So I don't want to be the guy that came to talk and wouldn't listen. First of all, the last time we looked at the ITRs in a WCIT meeting was something like 1988. And that was a time when most people didn't know anything about the internet at all, who were were opening up and looking at the ITRs. So the ITRs, not surprisingly, didn't speak in any direct way to the internet. Second, I think that it is very clear from the proposals that have been coming from the various member states in the ITU that there is a lot of interest in using modifications to the international telecommunications regulations to inject internet-related matters into its scope. And the way this is being done is by changing the definitions of things. One of the three-letter acronyms which has been used commonly for some time now is ICT, Information and Communications Technologies. The implication of putting the I in the ICT is that somehow or other telecommunications has become a matter of processing. It allows the members and the secretariat of the ITU to speak about computer communications in ways that they would not normally have been able to speak in the past. And this has opened up quite a wide range of potential for, let us say, mischief in this particular treaty. It may be the case that not every member country adopts all or even any of the proposals that show up in any revised RTRs. And so one mistaken belief is, well, suppose in the United States, suppose we reject all that and say we're not going to follow those rules, and therefore it won't affect us. The answer is it will affect us if others adopt those rules. In particular, for example, a proposal to return to a charging regime that involves settlements could have quite a dramatic effect on every one of us. Some of you may remember that in the telephony world, when you made a phone call, there was this sender pays model where you initiated the phone call and everybody in between you and the party you called is able to charge for the use of the telephone service, and in the end you get a bill. The settlement rates were determined by the receiving parties, and in some of the, especially the developing world, the prices were quite high, $11, $12, $13, $15, $16 a minute, things like that. And the claim was made that these high charges were needed in order to help propagate more infrastructure in the third world country. But the honest observation is a lot of those places had telephone services run by the government, and the people who were in charge of that sometimes siphoned some of that money off. So not all the money went for the purposes for which it was claimed it was needed. If we entered into a settlement regime in the internet space, it absolutely distorts and destroys the basic internet model, which is that each user pays to get access to the internet, and then you do whatever you want to do to first order. This has been an incredibly powerful model because it has allowed an enormous range of applications to be invented for which the net might not originally have been intended, but it doesn't matter because it's an end-to-end system. The notion of introducing settlements can have massive effects on the cost of operations for anybody who wants to bring up new applications on the internet. Can you imagine being a startup and being asked to do a negotiation with every ISP in the world before you can bring up a new application? I mean, it makes no sense at all. Well, I won't go on on this. I think I want to emphasize that there is real mischief and real harm that can come out of modifications of the ITRs in ways that draw internet concepts into its ambit. With permission, I'd like to add 4 other more general observations, and then we should go on to others. First of all, I think you should appreciate that what you do, what you have allowed to flourish, has caught the attention of governments. Sometimes it's not a good thing. Governments believe that they should protect their citizens from harm. And if there is belief that there is harm done to citizens by way of the internet, then governments are going to want to intervene. And I think everyone in this room has to admit that there are some harms that occur on the net, whether it's fraud or abuse or bullying or other kinds of things. And we have to accept that that's the case. We have to do something about it, but it may not be that clueless legislators are the right way in which to solve those problems. So this is a real risk, and it's a consequence of your success. The second is that the WCIT is only one of many events that are sponsored by the ITU. There's WITSA, which has to do with international standards. There's the plenipotentiary meeting in which the ITU revises its plans for each 4-year period. There are all kinds of events that occur. So WCIT is one of many possible hazards for all of us. This is why it's important to keep paying attention. The third point I want to make, and more generally, is that there is this thing called the Internet Governance Forum, which arose out of the World Summit on the Information Society. It is a non-decision-making activity. It is intended to be a multi-stakeholder event where people bring to the table issues that are arising in the operation and use of the Internet. I think we should preserve the IGF, and it's under some threat right now because its funding is not so clear, and although it originally was created out of an ITU-sponsored WSIS, it's in a state now where there's some risk. The reason it's so important is, first, it's multi-stakeholder, and second, since it doesn't make decisions, it's possible to get on the table fairly extreme points of view, but it's important to know what those are. And if this were a decision-making body where you had to negotiate a text of a communique, you would not get the same degree of candor that you get out of the existing IGF. So it's something that I believe needs to be preserved. And finally, I want to remind you of a little dialogue that took place in one of the Star Wars episodes. Luke Skywalker says, "I'm not afraid." And Yoda looks at him and says, "You will be. You will be. You should be afraid." Thank you very much.
I don't know whether to say thank you, Vint, or thank you, Yoda. You really did that well.
Obi-Wan, thank you very much.
And this is a great segue to Bill to talk about kind of what's in our future, which could be rather interesting.
Thanks, Cathy, and thanks for allowing me to be here today to talk to you about all of this. Vint has already alluded to the fact that the WCIT, which we're mostly concentrating on today, is only one of a whole time series of events that are coming up where internet governance and the future of the internet will be discussed. So I just kind of want to walk through what we've learned over the last few years about this and the kinds of events we're facing going forward. In the beginning, there was the World Summit on the Information Society. I remember back 2002 being in a UN meeting and someone said they're going to be talking about internet governance over in that room, and I said to some people, "What?" and went over, and I regret to say that was the beginning of this whole ball of wax. The outcomes of that was not too bad. A set of principles for internet governance were established at the head of state level through the United Nations. And really what that boiled down to was that internet governance was a multi-stakeholder endeavor, and that all the stakeholders needed to continue what they were doing in their respective roles. So in the case of ARIN, for example, handling the addresses and numbering resources is being done well. It's not a government process. ARIN should keep doing that, and all the other RIRs. So that's kind of where this all started. And being a UN organization, having that come down from the leaders was particularly important. The International Telecommunication Union was also recognized as the lead agency for implementing the WSIS. And that's where things started to go slightly sideways, because I don't think they have turned out to be a very disinterested party. Since the 2005 WCIT, they have had a series of events, starting notably with the Standardization Assembly 4 years ago in 2008, where they tried to set up an entity to really get very much involved in how IPv6 was handled. That turned into a multi-year working effort where the internet community had to really devote a tremendous amount of resources to stopping that. Their plenipotentiary conference, which is their main treaty event, took place in 2010. Again, they looked at the principles for internet governance, and for the first time they recognized the internet organizations in what we thought was positive text. Well, what's written and what gets used quite often differ. There has been increased interaction with the internet organizations, but a lot of it has not been very friendly. And we see moving forward a series of conferences. The next major one is the WCIT, which Cathy and Vint have talked about, where it's been interesting. There have been a lot of efforts by some of the member states of the ITU to bring up issues around that really involve the internet, things about spam and content control and again addressing and numbering. And the ITU staff have been saying, no, this is not about that. This is about telecommunication regulations. And Vint's gone through some of the things you need to be concerned about there, and I'm sure we'll hear more about those. What they do say, though, and the Secretary General of the ITU, Hamidou Touré, has said, it's not about the internet. What will be about the internet is the World Telecom Policy Forum in 2013. That's going to be all about internet governance. And the preparations for that have now begun, and there are some fairly intense negotiations going on around the text that will be discussed there. The good news about that is that unlike these treaty conferences, the Plenipot and the WCIT, this is a more open process, and they are inviting people to come in and participate in the drafting. But we are certainly a kind of second-class voice there, and it's going to be some tough slogging. The reason we get to participate in that is because it is not a treaty conference, and that in itself is a mixed blessing, because a lot of governments don't pay too much attention to conferences unless there's a treaty coming out the end. I can say, as someone who's been to these things for the Canadian government, we have not been as careful about the text that comes out of there as we should have been, and we've learned that we should have been because we've suffered from not doing it. U.S. government the same. Some of the European governments have really let things slide because these aren't binding. They can't do anything with this. Well, actually, that's proved to not be true. The 2008 Policy Forum produced some text that was then introduced to the next plenipotentiary conference, which is a treaty conference and really defines what the mandate and activities of the ITU will be, as though it was given. This is all agreed text. We just slide this straight into the treaty. And that was a huge battle in 2010 to turn that back a little bit. With the 13 event being all about internet governance, that's going to be much more intense. As there is another plenipotentiary conference in 2014. Again, I expect to see the text discussed in the WCIT brought up there. The World Telecommunications Policy Forum text will certainly be slid into the Plenipot discussions. There's another development conference also in 2014. That had the nature in 2010 of being a preparatory conference where developing countries were introduced to the internet governance text, and all with a view to having them take a stronger position at the Plenipot. So there is this whole series of events coming along in the ITU context that could ultimately lead to a greater mandate for the ITU to have a role in the internet as they define it. And that I think is what we really need to watch out for. There are other things going on. It's not only the ITU that's active in this. Vint's talked about the Internet Governance Forum. 2015 will be 10 years out from the World Summit on the Information Society. There will be WCIT plus 10 events, and it's shaping up now to have those events re-examine the text on Internet governance. So there are a lot of things going on that, if you were paranoid, you might think it's a stepwise plot to take over the Internet. I, of course, don't think that. I don't think they're that organized. But the point I'd like to make here is that it's really important to watch these issues. They're important for the Internet. They're important for your businesses. Keep on your governments. Let them know that you're interested. Certainly the U.S. government has processes for that to happen. Canadian government likewise. Write blogs. If you see things you are worried about, put it up in blogs. People are reading this. There's a huge civil society presence. And just keep the pressure up for these to be open processes and processes that progressive governments need to keep their eyes on. Thank you.
Encouraging, isn't it? This is your opportunity to get involved and see the world, or at least parts of it which consist of conference rooms. I think now we'll give the rest of the panelists a chance to kind of give their views on what's out there. And Sally, do you want to start up?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks to Cathy and ARIN for inviting us here. Just to continue to set the table and maybe start going into a few more specifics about the WCIT itself and the ITRs. It's important to understand the International Telecommunication Union is an organization with deep roots in the international community and in international law. It's been around since the 1800s. It has staying power. The treaty itself, the International Telecommunication Regulations, has its roots in the telegraph regulations. It has been revised periodically since the telegraph was in use and migrated into the International Telecommunication Regulations in 1988. And so, again, this is another piece of international law that does have staying power and is not going away. 1988, if you think back to what the world looked like in terms of international telecommunications, it was a world of largely government-owned monopolies, heavy state intervention in the marketplace to the extent that the marketplace existed. As Vint alluded to, extremely high costs for telephone calls, and essentially because of the heavy government intervention in the market, there was a necessity for a treaty in order to govern how international telecommunication traffic would be exchanged across borders. And that's what this treaty does. It's extremely high level, it's 15 pages, and at its core, its goal is to promote global interoperability and global interconnection. That's stated in the treaty. As has been noted, it has not been revisited since 1988. The world has changed. In terms of international law, we had a series of WTO negotiations that produced the Telecom Reference Paper, which introduced the concepts of competition, liberalization, independent regulation. All of the things that we sort of take for granted in international communications have really come about as a legal matter since the 1988 treaty was negotiated. So if one were to take a look at the treaty itself, you would not find the word competition in the treaty. You would not find references to liberalization. The concept of private-owned operators or service providers was not contemplated in the treaty. So for over a decade, governments have been sort of pushing around the edges of this and saying, look, the communications landscape has dramatically changed. We need to do something to make sure that this treaty reflects the changes in the communications landscape. Of course, the big elephant in the room is that the major change to international telecommunications landscape since 1988 has been, of course, the growth of the internet and the growth of IP-based traffic and all of the work that all of you are doing in the room today, which has, of course, taken place largely outside of this treaty context. So when we approach the international telecommunications regulations, we have to look at where we've come from, which is a heavily regulated, monopolized environment, a whole series of changes that have taken place since 1988, and a treaty that's wide open to accommodate those changes. And a whole lot of governments sitting around a table or in a room much like this, 193 governments that will, in fact, open that treaty up and say, in light of the changes since 1988, this is what we would like to see included. Those changes, as Vint and Cathy had noted, are looking at the fundamental level to increase the scope of application of that treaty. So the scope of the treaty currently is limited to governments and recognized operating agencies. There's a desire to open that up to include we don't know who. Operating agencies, whatever that means, content providers, internet service providers, equipment providers, end users. These devices could arguably be operating agencies. So we don't know what that means, which creates, of course, a tremendous amount of legal uncertainty. Scope of application extended beyond telecommunications to include ICTs. That could be the information that flows over the networks in addition to the networks themselves. We don't know. Other issues that have been specifically raised and called out in recent proposals, specifically wanting to address internet interconnection policies, the criteria that go into peering and transit relationships, quality of service versus best efforts, numbering, information, so again, information security, looking at the content going over the networks, spam would be a part of that, a whole range of security aspects, fraud, cybersecurity, cybercrime, cyber terrorism, and then obviously that reaches into the content layer. So you've got a lot of different agendas, some of it coming back to fundamental shifts in revenue streams, the fundamental shift in the business model that's taken place, others reacting to the security and the other very real concerns, as Vint pointed out. And others a very real desire to get their arms in a treaty context, to get their legal arms around this thing. Clause. The clause, yes. Around this thing that they don't have control over. And so I think, again, when we leave WCIT, we will have a new treaty. That treaty, assuming that they reach consensus on a treaty, that treaty will be obligatory for the member states that sign it. As Vince said, some of the governments may say we take major reservations, we're not going to apply this in our markets. The other thing to understand is in many developing countries, they take the treaty itself and incorporate it whole cloth into national law. Yeah. So if you do business in countries that do that, if you have interests in countries and markets that aren't US or Canada, which I suspect most of you in this room do, this will affect the legal and regulatory environment that you work in. So just to underscore, take it seriously, really look at it. There are a lot of materials available to help you go through it and look at it, but this isn't a declaration that sits on a shelf. This is a treaty that gets implemented and creates obligations that create rules for all of us in this space. So with that, I'll conclude. Thanks.
Thank you, Sally. So far, we've had one view that's kind of come from the Internet Society. Vint is all over the world. He's got a real global view of things. But I'd like now to talk to Dan and then Chip and get an idea of how they see this affecting, Comcast or carrier or Cisco, a manufacturer. So Dan, do you want to?
Morning. So Comcast has been working on IPv6 for a number of years. And it's difficult enough when you're dealing with project priorities, RFCs, financial budgets, development roadmaps, getting executive buy-off, testing. But what's interesting about it is all of that is a very iterative approach because we just don't get it right the first try. There's constant revisitings and there's an evolution to it. And the reason I bring that up is because it's difficult enough for a lot of the businesses in this room to move forward in this very fast-moving environment when we're dealing with, financial budgets and projects. But to shift from this kind of multi-stakeholder approach to solving problems to one of treaty-defined regulations adds a large layer of complexity to this situation that would become an issue for pretty much every business in this room. And that's one of the reasons why we've been trying to be involved in a lot of these conversations. And one thing that has always kind of struck me in sitting in a lot of these conversations is when government A is talking to government B, and they're very often, it gets sidetracked with debating the merits of one proposal over another. And we were actually kind of joking before this panel where I need a language class to understand all the subtleties of the communication between, well, my distinguished delegate from such and such, versus my esteemed colleague. And, there's such a different world there that often gets lost to engineers. This is actually where I think, and one of the reasons to try and tie this all together is where communities like NANOG can play such an important part, because when this community provides technical data, presentations, education, analysis, it goes a long way to refocus the conversations that governments are having so that they can point to hard data or reasons why, to make clear what the implications of some of the policies that they're discussing can have. Without all the data that's provided by communities like this, it just gets kind of lost into a conversation of us versus them, whereas you have real-world implications of why it would be a bad idea to create a regulation such as X. It's a lot easier to have a more constructive conversation. So this is, and that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to make a comment, because it's really where we can continue to affect this converging world of governments and engineers and how we can better communicate.
Sorry. Thank you. I guess from the perspective of equipment vendor, also I just want to mention that Cisco also runs a WebEx service in Jabber. So in a way, we also have over-the-top services that we operate as well that we need to consider. But it's very simple. Why am I involved? Why do I care about this? Is that for years we've been looking at supporting the growth and development of the internet, and fundamentally, that's what we're doing here. And in fact, I think that's also the overriding aim of the U.S. Going into the WCIT. First, I do need to say that my comments here don't reflect Cisco's position on anything in particular, or the position of the U.S. delegation to WCIT. But that is essentially the reason that we are engaged here, is that we've been promoting growth and development of the internet globally for many years, and we want the growth to continue. I think we've seen great strides in the last 5 years in many areas. I think you all are aware of the fiber that's been rolled into Africa over the last 5 years, the tremendous growth in fiber. I was talking to an engineer from Vodacom in Tanzania. He came and attended a workshop I gave, and he attended a workshop that we gave about 3 or 4 years ago. And I asked him, I was talking to him, well, what's different? He says, right now, his biggest issue is trying to keep up. Yeah. Previously, he had the issue, how do I get connectivity? How do I get international connectivity? Now they're trying to figure out, how do I grow my network to match the bandwidth coming into the country, because it's exploded so much. So things are changing. And we want to continue that growth and continue that development and enable growth and development. And we don't want to have, treaty obligations that are going to restrict that growth. And that's fundamentally the reason that, we're engaged here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. You've all kind of heard what's out there, and hopefully you're all still awake and not totally bored with this. But please, if you've got some questions, some of the things I think you've heard should have, if nothing else, gotten your blood pressure up a little bit to wonder, oh, I have a question.
It's not a question, but it's an observation that occurred to me as I listened to my colleagues. One of the problems with introducing Internet into a treaty-like environment is that it has the potential to politicize the Internet. The debates and discussions about policy for Internet should not be mixed together with other disagreements that countries might have with each other, because this leads to a tit-for-tat kind of behavior where a trade dispute leads to an attempt to interfere with Internet's operation as a way of trying to pay back. So this is one of the dangers of allowing Internet to show up in the treaty world. The second observation I make is that informality has been our friend. It certainly has been our friend in terms of connectivity and negotiating peering arrangements of various kinds. But I'd also cite an example of the Configure virus, for example, or Configure worm, instituted or caused to be created a very informal working group that involved government agencies, involved law enforcement, it involved the technical community, and so on. Completely informal. And the reason that it worked is precisely because it didn't have a whole bunch of complicated rules and treaty arrangements and everything else. Those 2 points, I think, should be kept in mind as we worry about the side effects of this the potential introduction of Internet into a treaty-like setting.
Thank you, Vint. Okay, I'm going to start with center front. Please identify yourself and who, if you're directing a question to a panelist or whoever. Okay. So center front, please.
Hello, my name is Patrick Gilmore. I work for Akamai Technologies. First thing I'd like to say is thank you all for working on this, because this is desperately important. I want to make sure everybody in the room is awake, because it's going to affect every single one of you, whether you like it or not, so make sure. Just a couple of quick comments, at least I hope they'll be quick. Cathy, I'd like to take issue with the statement that you started off the panel with. The ITU is not trying to take over the Internet. And the very next statement you said is it may address routing, it may address addressing. It turns out it may address spam, it may address security, it may address QoS, it may address settlements. And somebody, I forget which gentleman it was, said that this is not a creeping vision of the ITU because they're not that organized. The thing is, stupidity is indistinguishable from malice. And at the end of the day, if they do enough things, they have taken over the Internet. And this is provably, objectively harmful, and it needs to be stopped. The other thing that was said on the panel, sorry, I have to actually look at my notes to make sure I get everything right, is that the ITU is specifically made to promote global interconnectivity and communication. The Internet has promoted that far better than anything the ITU has ever dreamt of putting into place. And so for the ITU to say, well, we need to do this to promote something when it is objectively, provably true that they will actually harm that, is a bad thing. And there are lots of people working on this. We just had a peering track yesterday where Bill Woodcock presented a paper he co-wrote for the OECD proving that deregulation and open and lack of monopolies in a country, lower prices, increase connectivity, allow the reach to extend and things like that. And this is being presented at the WCIT, I believe. I've gone to Brussels and tried to pound this into people's heads, trying to do things with BEREC and OECD and stuff. But not enough people in this room realize that if you don't do this, if you don't talk your lawyers and bosses into this, if you don't spend your time reading these papers, if you don't send emails, that they will do it. And you will all be hurt for it. And it scares me shitless. So wake the hell up, okay?
Thanks.
Do you need a change of underwear?
Okay, I'll go. Thank you, Patrick. You passed because Dan said earlier about needing language lessons to understand what's being said. I picked my words very carefully. There has not been one contribution that says that the internet should be under the ITU. However, that's what you have to look at, because if it were that blatant, it would be really simple. It's a little contribution that comes in from this country or that country that suggests that maybe they could do this or this should happen. That's what makes the difference, and that's what makes it so difficult.
Yep.
So it should have you at least paying attention.
And that's also why I picked my words carefully, saying that, it won't, the difference is indistinguishable once they do these little things. So we are in violent agreement. I just hope everybody else here didn't take they're not trying to take over the internet and think, oh, well, then it's okay. That's the main point.
Be very careful. You're going really close to turning into a policy wonk. Back. Center back.
Yeah, I'm Bill Dart. I'm on the ARIN Advisory Council, but I'm just making an observation. First of all, I want to thank you all for bringing this topic in such a transparent way to everybody. But I also liked what Dan said about the vernacular and how different it is. And I think that's one of the problems of having this conversation in this room and in other rooms, is that we don't have that vernacular. And in fact, as much as I try to pay attention to this, and when I have conversations with other people about this threat or the actions that are going on around the world, I don't do that very well, because I don't have all the concepts well formed in my head. I don't have the vernacular that makes the difference. And so I think if you're trying to marshal the efforts of people in this room and in other people who don't really get it, don't really understand it, they need tools that would be effective in helping them begin a conversation with their lawyers or their senior executives or their public outreach officials inside their organizations. They need the tools that you guys could present or create that they could then take back to those people that would explain this or give them access to other people who could talk at the same, within the same context that they understand. So if you have tools like that, I think they would be very useful. If not, you're asking people to go have conversations that they're incapable probably of having.
Something clearly that we need to work on. Thank you. Sally?
Thanks for that comment, and apologies in advance for the shameless plug. But Internet Society, working very closely with ARIN and with the other regional internet registries and others in the internet community, have been trying to put together those resources, and a number of us on our websites have those available. ISOC has published a matrix of some of the proposals. One of the things that's very useful from where I sit and trying to interact on these issues, I can speak the language of the policy people because that's from where I come, but you all are the experts. Take a look at a single proposal and dissect it from where you sit. Analyze it in a real-world example, put it on a blog, post it in a paper, send it to us, any of us. It would be extraordinarily useful because it takes it from the level of the abstract and puts it into the tangible of, in my business life or in my particular environment, if this proposal were foisted upon me, how would that affect what I'm doing? It doesn't have to be a thesis, in fact, preferably not. Shorter is better, but do take a look at some of these proposals, take one or two, pull them apart and say this is what it would mean. That kind of work is extremely useful and much, much needed.
Thank you, Sally. Center front.
Jeff Houston, APNIC. I kind of wonder if there's a deeper malaise out there, and this is an expression of an industry in deep trouble. Back in 1988, the telephone companies ruled most of the world. They owned the handset, they owned the wire, they owned the switching. The regulatory environment actually underpinned that, and it owned so much money that it actually siphoned off large percentages to the developing world because it felt nice and everyone felt good about it. The internet seems always to me to be an exercise in Swedish minimalism taken well beyond the extreme. Those 20 bytes of header do nothing. And actually, if you look inside the network itself, you find nothing. Packets can be dropped, packets can be reordered. They're just packets. There's no calls, there's no transaction, there's no service, whether it's quality or not. There's nothing. So that what we are plumbers down there at the sewerage and commodity level. People don't join the internet and use it because they admire the packets. They go there for the apps. They go there for the services, but we don't run the services. Other folk do that. And this fight is actually a fight about a dwindling pool of money, because most of the riches of the telephone company were riches about the services of people speaking. And the riches of today are the riches of people using the network for goods and services, well beyond the remit of the ITU. They don't apply to Word or Excel or PowerPoint, do they? Maybe they might later, but they don't at this point. What's left is a very small pool of money left in the telecommunications industry. And most of the folk are looking at that pool going, how do I get more of it? When you've got a shockingly bad, broken business plan that's unsustainable, the best thing you can do is seek regulatory relief. And the best regulatory relief on the planet is international, because it trumps all this national crap. To what extent are we seeing a bunch of losers trying to promote broken business plans by heading off to Geneva and screaming loudly because this is the last gasp of a telephone industry that should have died a decade ago and is now in its dying throes? To what extent are we just seeing the tail of the dinosaur thrashing about in the swamp?
Excellent. If I can get a short comment out of Vint, because then we have 11 minutes left, and I'd like to get to all of the other people that are standing up and wrap up. So Vint?
Just one observation. Not only should the telephone industry have died some time ago, but the ITU should have died along with it. I will say that ITU-D, the development agency, which is the largest budget, and ITU-R, which deals with radio spectrum, has actually been helpful in my view, and so I'm not suggesting the entire ITU should go away. But there was a particular European telecommunications network operators, Etno, that's been screaming loudly about the whole settlements notion, which characterizes precisely what Jeff has said. They are the painful dying screams of an industry that no longer makes any sense given the technology we have before us.
Thank you. Center back.
Hi, I'm Jeff Oz, and I'm with Juniper Networks. I wanted to briefly ask about settlements. One of the benefits we've had of the internet is usually once you've gotten your connection to it, it doesn't matter what you're accessing. You know, the peering sessions, et cetera, have been negotiated, all the money is happening behind the scenes, but as an end user, it doesn't cost you more to go to one site than another, you know, for the most part. If we introduce the notion of settlements in there, and the things that this is going to do to routing truly horrify me, has the ITU actually discussed the impact on the fact that somebody in the middle of Africa now going to some site in the US is going to cost significantly more versus someplace else for potentially different levels of content? What is that going to do to the internet experience, and what is that going to do to the things that we actually get out of the internet?
Oh, Chip, you want to go?
Right, in short, Study 3 and IQT has been discussing this since about 1998, 1999. Has been discussing this issue. And it's going to continue discussing it in the next study period for the next 4 years. So I guess the answer to that part of the question is yes, there is a group within I2T that is discussing this issue.
But I guess I would, just to jump in on that, the proposal specifically that's come forward from the European telecom network operators is a somewhat new construction of things that have been discussed in the ITU in the past. And I think the answer to that question of what would it mean for developing countries, in our opinion, not enough research and analysis has really been done. We have some very good ideas of what would happen, and we think it would be in the long term bad interests of developing countries for these kinds of proposals to be instituted. But you would have, of course, huge architectural issues, as somebody said, with routing to actually even implement this, which is kind of makes your head hurt if you go there. And then the regulatory implications and all of the other things, and then you get to the industrial and the development implications. You know, when you put a proposal like this on the table and you want it in a treaty, in our opinion, you should have to do this sort of economic impact analysis, technical impact analysis, so everyone knows what they're buying. And that really, in that sense specifically, the Aetna proposal, we don't think that that's been adequately done.
Okay, center front.
Scott Bradner, Harvard University, ARIN Board, and Internet Society. From the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, I was the Internet Society Vice President for Standards, and as such was the liaison between the Internet Society, IETF, and the ITU. In one of those pennypot meetings that was referred to earlier, the ITU had a proposal on the table which fundamentally designated it as the Internet Standards Body. And it looked like it was going to pass. It turned out not to, but in the interim, while it looked like it was going to pass, we had an IETF meeting. And we had one of the ITU staff members come to the meeting. I tell this story just to indicate the mindset. The staff member came to me and said, in my role as VP for Standards, that this proposal was going to pass, and therefore he was needed to work out with me a way for the IETF to get its standards, submit its standards to the ITU for review and approval. And the IETF's an independent organization. It's not under any government rules or anything. But the mindset was, well, but the governments, our member state governments, have told us to do this, so therefore we have the right to do it, and you will obey. This is the mindset that is present in the ITU, and while a lot of people look at these proposals and say, well, we'll just ignore them, it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all. Governments who have other missions, other incentives, whether it's radio spectrum or satellite slots or money, are going to make it hard to just ignore them. We can't just be the libertarian internet that we have been for so long. We have to pay attention to the real world, and the real world can get pretty damn ugly pretty fast with some of these proposals. The settlements proposal actually is simpler and worse than what it seems, in that the proposal is that the sender pays, but in reality the way that works for a small country, or a big country for that matter, is that the ISP in the country can charge the ISP delivering the packets to the country for delivering the packets to the end user. That's the way it works in the telephone world. But what does that mean? So a number of big US universities are putting together these massive systems for online education, hundreds of thousands of people per course for a number of different courses. Stanford started at 150,000 people in a physics course. These are online systems. They're providing online education for free. And it's worth at least twice that. It's some good stuff, even if it's from Stanford. So some student in Tanzania decides they want to take one of these courses, and they start viewing the material. It's a lot of videos, a reasonable amount of data. The ISP that is delivering the bits to that student goes to the international ISP saying, okay, give me money to deliver those bits to that student. That ISP has no relationship to Harvard, has no way to have a relationship to Harvard, so we'll stop delivering the bits because there'll be nobody to pay them. That's the result of this kind of situation. It's not good.
Thank you, Scott. Senator Back?
My name is Andrew Sullivan. I work for Dine. I wanted to ask anybody on the panel, really, suppose that, so Dine's not a huge operation. There's fewer than 200 of us. And suppose that I take some of my employer's time and invest it in, looking at some of these proposals and doing the analysis, doing the technical analysis, doing the nice, monetary analysis like one we saw this morning. Is anybody going to listen to that, or is that just a waste of time? Because that's one of the real basic questions that I have. I just don't know what kind of influence I have on the various people who are negotiating these agreements. And if I'm going to do that work and nobody's going to do anything with it anyway, I might as well just go and find a way to route around this damage.
Please don't. That's before I call on you, Steve. Wicket may be really close and almost over. Countries have their delegations ready, and some of them have clamped down now and are just preparing for that. But Bill said it, Sally said it, Vint said it, Dan, Chip. This is an ongoing exercise. And if we don't get clipped in Wicket, there's more opportunities, and you need to think about it and participate. Steve, Senator Back.
Thank you. My name is Steve Ryan. I'm a lawyer and represent ARIN, but I'm going to reflect more on my experience as General Counsel of the United States Senate Committee. I think we have to mature our view of government. So our government in the United States, where we're located today, which is not the only government in the ARIN service region, is more like the former Yugoslavia. That is, there's Bosnia, there's Herzegovina, there's Croatia, in the way it operates. And so slices of the U.S. government have a very mature view of internet governance, and others have an immature view of that governance. Immaturity is sometimes a word associated with the United States Congress, but not always. And there are times where the United States Congress reflects a schizophrenic view. So if we start outward from our own government, which some days wants to control the internet and other days reflects the white and green paper reality that created non-governmental organizations like this, that non-governmental structure that we sit in is an absolute challenge to the BRIC countries. They do not recognize or wish to be governed by non-governmental organizations. They like government. They believe that government is the reflection of the society that they live in that should govern us. And we, of course, fought a revolution in this particular country to get rid of that view. So as we go forward, it seems to me we have to mature, and I think ISOC is very, very important in this activity, but we have to mature our relationship, for example, to our intelligence agencies, our law enforcement agencies, to aspects of civil society, such as those who can be impaired by counterfeiting, so that we don't take a reflexive view. And I think our non-governmental organization here has actually matured very much in that way, in that we have law enforcement people in the room today, we have civil society in the room today, and we actually try and work out our policies here. What I want to say, I guess, is that other governments just simply don't accept that conceptual framework. And so the worst of these is the UN structure, the ITU structure, because here's a bureaucracy that literally is threatened with extinction, that the gravy train may end because the technology has changed, and they're not going to permit that. So as we go forward, people want to refer to Michel's theory that organizations begin with a purpose, like the ITU of giving geosynchronous orbits or of doing the tariffs between countries, but it's not a bureaucracy that will go away unless you stake it in the heart, which I'm not suggesting that we have any interest in doing. That would be wrong, and the metaphor would not be proper. But in any case, the notion, by the way, that we in the internet community, it's an education issue, and it seems to me the responsibility is to educate all governments that have our Western view, particularly, of a limited governmental role, that they actually recognize the stakes that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Steve. Before I turn it to the panel, I'd just like to say, you have to remember there's three kinds of governments. Clint Eastwood identified the good, the bad, the ugly. We've got the good, the bad, and the clueless. And we can laugh at that, but it is a serious issue when you have people making judgments on things they know nothing about. Dan.
I was just going to go back to what the previous gentleman at the mic had brought up, because there are two sides to a piece of this, in that everyone in the room here, in a lot of cases, would be very happy to provide information or do the analysis, but they have to question, is the effort worth my time, or what are we really going to get out of this? On the other side of that, there are actually organizations and governments out there with sincere questions, and like you're saying, maybe not necessarily clueless, but they don't know where to look or where to go for the answers or how to go about solving those problems. So I think a worthwhile conversation along these lines is how to better place the question with the answer, and how to facilitate these two worlds kind of communicating together. Whether ISOC would be a good home for that, or whether somewhere else would. I think that's a productive conversation.
Chip?
Thank you. I think Dan touched on one of the things I wanted to follow up on. One thing is, in my work over the last couple of years, attending these meetings and talking with people, is that these are real people with real problems that they have to solve. I mean, they're faced with real problems that they're dealing with, and many times they're understaffed. They do not have the luxury of having separate bureaus to handle each type of communication. They may sometimes have one person to deal with all of it. So, the more that we can help them, the better. Sometimes even if we don't agree with their position, that they are still struggling with some of these serious problems that they're dealing with in their countries. So I think that's one thing we can look at, and following up on Dan, is one important item is, in terms of helping, is outreach. Is if you meet the regulators or ministry officials from other developing countries or the world, work with them and help them understand how the internet works, and help answer their questions, because they do not have the luxury of having an industry experts coming in and providing them information or helping assist them on technical questions. So that's one real way that we can help is that outreach and is the education. I know ISOC has instituted a great program, I think, recently, of inviting people to IETF meetings. And if you run into any of them at IETF, help introduce yourself, help them, and ask them what their concerns are, and help them understand the effect on your business and effect on their networks and what's going on in their country. So that's my main, I guess, addressing some of the comments that came out earlier, is that if we can help them, then let's do what we can to help them out there. So thanks.
Okay, I'm going to call on Sally, then Vint, then Bill, and keep it really short because they've been nice enough to give us 2 minutes and 39 more seconds. So speak quickly. Thank you.
Just to speak very quickly, in response, I think, to that question of whether all that work would have an impact, I do think the answer is yes. I think that the internet community is having more of an impact than probably ever before on these discussions. Countries are asking the questions. They are coming to each of us at the table with genuine questions and an interest in the answers. So if ever there were a time to do that analysis and to provide your perspective, I think this is it. So if I could leave you with anything, I would say don't be discouraged and weigh in. It's really important to do that now.
I hate to finish this up with an observation, but let me explain to you that this is much more tricky and dangerous than you could possibly imagine. Let's suppose that we were able to explain to every single legislator and every operator that is making policy decisions exactly what the impact of some of these things would be on the internet. Now, we all think that if it's bad for the internet, it's bad. There are some people who would like the internet not to work. And so when we explain very carefully to them why these following policies are bad because they disrupt the utility of the internet, they will say, man, this is a really good idea because we don't want the internet around. So don't forget that there are multiple incentives hiding behind this facade of debate, and that some of them are not in the interest of the internet at all.
Yes, thanks, Cathy. Just really quickly, I'd say that one thing that's been really important is recognizing the opportunity cost of all this. You know, we are takers in terms of these conferences, and we have to rise to the challenge. And that's been a hard lesson to learn, that there actually is a reason why we actually have to pay for that risk mitigation, if I can call it that, because this won't go away. On the positive side, I really think the internet community is figuring out better how to engage with governments in very positive ways, bringing them to the IETF, bringing them to meetings like this, engaging at the Internet Governance Forum, and that's creating a more openness among governments that are not actually hardcore trying to kill the internet, and that's really where we need to build our support. Thank you.
Thank you, and I just encourage everybody, most of us will be around for the ARIN meeting and such. If you've got any questions or thoughts, please don't hesitate to come see any of us, and thank you very much, and go enjoy whatever's next.